There's been a fascinating video floating around recently of a 2015 Game Developers Conference presentation. In this presentation, Volition senior producer Greg Donovan discusses the vertical slice of Volition's last 6 games. A vertical slice, or VS, is when a company makes a small piece of their upcoming game in a deadline that has every possible component working in it. As interesting as the whole video may be, its never-before-seen Saints Row content is undeniably the most incredible part of the presentation. If you have a free hour, I highly recommend watching the entire video, but in case you can't, enjoy as we go in-depth into the never-before-seen makings of Saints Row 1 through 4. With all that said, let's take a slice right in. So right off the bat, Greg Donovan begins his presentation with Saints Row 1. Prior to Saints Row 1, Volition had never attempted to make a vertical slice. After 5 months of work, a small section of Stillwater was made called Phase 5. Phase 5 consisted of 4 blocks, then a month after that it was filled with functioning vehicles, AI, and basic gameplay mechanics. Greg Donovan then goes on to show actual gameplay from Phase 5 that is quite astonishing. It begins by showing a billboard with the company Genital Corp on it. As far as I can tell, this billboard and company did not make it into the final game. Then the video goes on to showing gameplay of the boss driving a tow truck. It's interesting to note that the tow truck did not make it into the final release of Saints Row 1, but later appeared in Saints Row 2. Next, the video moves on to the player doing a drive-by on some early Vice King models. 2 things you'll probably notice here are the sitting up firing animations not used in the final game and that the Saints are wearing green. Before the release at Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, green was the original intended gang color for the Saints. Anyways, this shot also reveals another company that didn't make it into the final game called JSS Shipping. I'll just let that set in for a second. We're then shown some more tow truck gameplay, and it appears the gravity was considerably more floaty at this point. Next, we're shown melee and firing mechanics. Some of the player's clothing here and the shotgun he's using do not appear in the final release. The last few shots of the video show early explosion effects and ragdoll physics. I must admit, for how early this Phase 5 gameplay is, the driving, combat, and physics are all quite impressive. After the video, Greg Donovan explains the pros and cons that came from the vertical slice, then goes straight into talking about Saints Row 2. Even before Saints Row 1 was released, Saints Row 2 had already started pre-production. The vertical slice for Saints Row 2 took Saints Row 1's base code and was primarily intended to make as many new features as possible. Though Donovan couldn't find footage from the actual vertical slice, he did however get a hold of a vision piece that has all the vertical slice features in it. The video starts with Volition's original concept for Saints Row 2's downtown district. Though the district was considerably changed in the final release, it didn't implement all the buildings and designs shown here. Next, new locations of Stillwater are shown, like the undergrounds and disaster areas. As far as I know, most of these locations are in the final game, but the burning buildings were changed to rubble. We're then shown Saints Row 2's enhanced customization. Not much to say here, it looks fairly similar to what we see in the actual game. Now, let me just say in advance that the rest of the gameplay shown will look more like Saints Row 1 rather than Saints Row 2. People I've talked to like to call it Saints Row 1.5 gameplay. So with that said, the video goes on to show upgradable cribs, even though they're all existing locations in Saints Row 1. Then we're shown some flashy shots of recruiting and customizing homies before, whoa! Have you ever thought you would see pilotable aircrafts in Saints Row 1, let alone motorcycles, electric scooters, and boats? Next, we see improved combat mechanics. Now this is starting to look more familiar to Saints Row 2. Here we see the player beating the hell out of Mr. Wong. It's a shame that last takedown didn't make it into the final game. Next, we see something called Turf War. I'm guessing this was a diversion similar to when owned districts were under siege. A big difference, however, seems to be assaulting a store owner. This seems like it would have been an intriguing feature if it was left in the game. I definitely get a vibe from the Godfather games when I see it. Activities are shown next, and the first one is something we've never seen before. It looks like a variation of Mayhem where you drive the Ken around. Then there's a quick glimpse of the flashing diversion before we see the player running around on fire. Thanks to Scott Phillips breathing life into an open world lecture, we know this cut diversion was called Human Torch. It's almost like the streaking diversion combined with trailblazing. Oh, and speaking of streaking, it looks like the original nude sensor was just a black bar rather than the mosaic blur we see in the final game. And oh my god, this cut wrecking ball activity looked freaking amazing. It looks like the goal was to destroy every car and shanty within a time limit while also not damaging the wrecking ball too much. This could have been my all-time favorite activity if it made it into the final release. Moving on, concept art is shown of the rival gangs we're familiar with, and hold up, the leaders of progression? Yeah, so I guess these guys were in line before the Sons of Samdi were conceived. This gang has actually been shown before in one of Volition's 10th anniversary streams. And so, there you have the vision piece for Saints Row 2. Quite a lot of impressive things and concepts that could have made it into the game. At this point in the presentation, Greg Donovan goes on to discuss Red Faction Guerrilla and Red Faction Armageddon's vertical slices. As interesting as they may be, for the sake of this video we're skipping them and going straight into Saints Row the Third. As explained by Donovan, Saints Row the Third's vertical slice had the art and design teams working separate from each other. The plan was for the teams to work uninterrupted, then marry the two efforts together for one final vertical slice. The first video Greg displays is from the art side of the vertical slice, which shows a store's interior from the now popular 2009 build of the game. Something fun to note is that this location is still in the final game, and all the fruit boxes have the city's original name on them, Bridgeport. The next video is from the design team's side of the vertical slice, and it's quite fascinating. Outside the 2009 trailer, this is the first time we get to see this build's gameplay with a functioning player model. Before, we can only see the 2009 build with slew mode since the player was stuck in a T-pose. The player's phone here is slightly different compared to the final game. The biggest difference is an app called Empire Mode. This was replaced with the Saints book in the final release. For a split second, you could see a small part of the original map of Bridgeport in the background. Thanks to some of these screenshots online, we have an idea of what the entire original map used to look like. Back to the design gameplay, we see two missions from Samson and Julius? Okay, before freaking out, Volition was only using existing assets for this scene. Anyways, the actual purpose of this particular video was to show the game's transitions. You can see when the player reaches the mission start destination that the original transition screen was vastly different from what we got in the final game. I actually prefer this transition over the purple screenshots were shown in the final release. And that's it for Saints Row the Third's vertical slice. As for Saints Row 4's, there unfortunately isn't a lot of new information that we didn't already know. Greg Donovan basically explains how the Enter the Dominatrix DLC for Saints Row the Third was in production, but THQ had them converted into Saints Row 4. He also briefly touches upon Saints Row 4 Prime, but if you want all the information known about that game, check out the Volition stream during the 10th anniversary of Saints Row 1. Well everyone, I hope you found this never before seen Saints Row content as wild and incredible as I did. Before I end the video, there's something important I need to bring up. A friend of mine and fellow Saints Row fan lost his home in a fire a week ago and is in dire need of help. If you have any money to spare, please visit the link down in the description. Well anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.